In the merciless skies over Nazi Germany, the most terrifying realization for an American bomber crew wasn't just the sight of a German Focke-Wulf diving out of the blinding sun. It was the agonizing moment they looked out their frozen windows and realized their own American fighter escorts had completely abandoned them. Welcome back to the archive. I am Henry, and today we are opening the classified files on a legendary squadron of men who were handed a suicide mission by a nation that largely despised them, only to become the most requested guardian angels of the Second World War. This is not the sanitized Hollywood version of the Tuskegee Airmen. This is the raw, unvarnished history of the Red Tails, a story about how iron discipline and unspoken brotherhood triumphed over the lethal ego of the fighter ace. To understand the sheer gravity of what these men accomplished, you have to understand the absolute slaughterhouse that was the Daylight strategic bombing campaign over Europe in 1943 and 1944. The Allied High Command believed that heavily armed bomber formations, primarily the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, could fight their way to German industrial targets and back without fighter escort. They were catastrophically wrong. The bombers were slow, massive targets, and the Luftwaffe's veteran pilots tore them to absolute shreds. Missions to places like Schweinfurt and Regensburg resulted in such staggering losses that bomber crews were mathematically guaranteed to die before completing their 25 mission tours. The interior of a B-17 at 25,000 feet was a freezing, deafening nightmare of flak bursts, shattered plexiglass, and the constant smell of cordite and copper. When fighter escorts finally arrived in the theater, the bomber crews wept with relief. But that relief was often brutally short-lived. The culture of the fighter pilot is, by its very nature, built on aggression, individual skill, and the relentless pursuit of the kill. White American fighter pilots flying P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts were constantly chasing the coveted title of ace. When a pack of German fighters appeared, the instinct of many American escort pilots was to drop their external fuel tanks, break formation, and dive into a dogfight to rack up personal victories. While the fighters engaged in spectacular aerial duels miles away, the slow-moving bombers were left completely naked, sitting ducks for secondary waves of German interceptors. Bomber pilots returning to base, their aircraft riddled with hundreds of bullet holes and carrying dead or dying crew members, were harboring a furious, unspoken resentment toward their own glory-hunting escorts. The situation demanded a radical change in tactical doctrine, but what it actually got was a social experiment that the military brass had fully expected, and in many cases actively hoped, would fail. Enter the 332nd Fighter Group, an all-black unit of aviators trained in Tuskegee, Alabama. In the fiercely segregated military of the 1940s, these men had to fight a war on two fronts: fascism abroad and systemic, crushing racism at home. An infamous 1925 Army War College report had officially and absurdly declared that black men lacked the intelligence, the reflexes, and the courage for aerial combat. Consequently, the Tuskegee Airmen were subjected to training standards so astronomically high and a washout rate so intentionally brutal that only the absolute finest aviators survived the program. They arrived in the European theater with something to prove, but their commanding officer, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., understood a grim reality. He knew that if his men behaved like the white fighter pilots, if they broke formation to chase personal glory and left bombers undefended, the racist establishment back in Washington would instantly use it as an excuse to shut down the entire program and ground every black pilot in the military. Davis gathered his men and issued an uncompromising, ironclad directive that would fundamentally alter the legacy of the air war. He looked his pilots in the eye and delivered an order that went against every instinct of a fighter pilot. He told them that their mission was not to shoot down German planes. Their singular, sacred duty was to protect the bombers. If they abandoned the heavy bombers to chase a fleeing Messerschmitt, they would not be celebrated. They would be court-martialed. They were to stay with the bombers through the flak, through the freezing cold, and through the heaviest enemy attacks. They were to be the shield, not the sword. And to make sure friend and foe alike knew exactly who was providing that shield, they painted the entire tail sections of their P-51 Mustangs a brilliant, unmistakable crimson. The era of the red tails had begun, and the skies over Europe were about to witness a masterclass in tactical discipline. When the bomber crews of the 15th Air Force first saw the distinctive red-painted empennage of the P-51 Mustangs sliding into formation alongside their battered B-17s and B-24s, the initial reaction inside the frozen fuselages was often a complex mixture of confusion, skepticism, and deeply ingrained societal prejudice. Many of these young, white bomber crews, hailing from a segregated America, had no idea that black fighter pilots even existed, let alone that they were now entrusted with their very survival. But at 25,000 feet, where the air is thin enough to kill a man, and the temperature drops to 60 degrees below zero, the superficial constructs of race rapidly dissolve into the visceral, primitive mathematics of life and death. The crucible of combat over the Third Reich was about to forge an unprecedented brotherhood. The standard German Luftwaffe tactic against daylight bombing raids was brutally effective and highly orchestrated. German flight leaders would often send a small, fast element of Focke-Wulf 190s or Messerschmitt 109s to act as bait. Their goal was to taunt the American escorts, feigning vulnerability to draw the P-51s and P-38s away from the heavy bombers. Once the eager American fighter jocks took the bait and dove away to chase the elusive kills, the main German interceptor force, heavily armed with cannons and rockets, would plunge into the unprotected bomber streams, turning the sky into an absolute slaughterhouse of tearing metal and burning fuel. It was a deadly psychological game that relied entirely on the ego of the American fighter pilot. But when the Luftwaffe tried this tactic against the 332nd Fighter Group, they hit an unbreakable wall of discipline. German pilots would dive, present their tails, and wait for the chase. But the Mustangs with the red tails simply refused to follow. Instead of breaking formation, the Tuskegee Airmen executed a complex, weaving defensive screen right above and alongside the lumbering bombers. When the main German attack force arrived, expecting naked targets, they were instead met head-on by a furious swarm of red tails. The Tuskegee pilots would engage fiercely, firing lethal bursts of 50 caliber machine gun fire to break up the enemy attacks. But the moment the German fighters disengaged and dove away, the red tails did the unthinkable. They stopped pursuing. Fighting every natural instinct of a combat aviator, they choked back their adrenaline, abandoned the chase, and immediately snapped their Mustangs back into strict formation around the bombers. For a fighter pilot, letting a smoking, vulnerable enemy aircraft escape is a form of psychological torture. But the Red Tails remembered the ironclad mandate of Colonel Davis. They stayed in the lethal flak boxes, absorbing the anti-aircraft fire right alongside the heavy bombers, acting as a physical shield. The impact of this radical tactical discipline was immediate and profound. Down in the belly of the bombers, the ball turret gunners and tail gunners watched in absolute awe as their red-tailed escorts fought off wave after wave of interceptors without ever abandoning their posts. They watched these pilots risk their own lives to fly through curtains of exploding flak just to stay close. When the battered bomber formations limped back to their bases in Italy, the debriefing rooms were filled with a new, reverent murmuring. The crews were reporting survival rates that defied the grim statistics of the air war. Word began to spread like wildfire across the airfields of Europe. Legends, born from pure relief and gratitude, began to circulate that the 332nd had never lost a single bomber to enemy fighters. While historical records later corrected this to show a small number of losses, the fact remained that their success rate in protecting bombers was so astronomically high that the myth became their defining truth. The deeply rooted racism that had infected the military establishment began to crack under the undeniable weight of their competence. Bomber commanders, men who might have previously questioned the capability of black aviators, were now doing something completely unprecedented. They were actively picking up the telephone and aggressively demanding that the 332nd Fighter Group be assigned to escort their crews on the most dangerous, deep penetration missions into the heart of the German war machine. The men who had been treated as second-class citizens by their own country had transformed themselves into the most fiercely requested, highly respected guardian angels of the sky, and they were about to face their ultimate test against a terrifying new weapon that threatened to change the course of the war. The ultimate test of the 332nd Fighter Group arrived in the dying months of the war, wrapped in the terrifying shriek of a brand new technology that threatened to rip the Allied bomber fleets out of the sky. As the American forces pushed closer to the heart of the Third Reich, the desperation of the German High Command birthed the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter. These swept-wing monsters could fly at speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour, making them nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the fastest P-51 Mustangs in the American arsenal. To the slow-moving bomber crews, the jets were an absolute nightmare, appearing out of nowhere, unleashing devastating barrages of heavy cannon fire, and vanishing before traditional escort fighters could even turn to engage them. The Allied command was panicked, fearing that swarms of these new jets could inflict such catastrophic losses that the daylight bombing campaign would have to be halted entirely. But when the Red Tails encountered this technological terror over the skies of Berlin, they did not panic, nor did they abandon their strict defensive doctrine. They understood that while the jets were incredibly fast in a straight line, they were heavily burdened and relatively unmaneuverable when climbing to attack the bombers, and particularly vulnerable when turning. On March 24, 1945, during the longest bomber escort mission of the war targeting a massive tank factory in Berlin, the Tuskegee Airmen proved that superior discipline and tactical brilliance could defeat superior machinery. Flying their crimson-tailed Mustangs, pilots like Roscoe Brown, Charles Brantley, and Earl Lane engaged the terrifying German jets. Instead of trying to outrun them, they used their altitude advantage and the jet's wider turn radius to dive relentlessly, pouring .50 caliber fire into the vulnerable engines of the Me-262s. On that single day over Berlin, the men who had been deemed unfit for combat by their own war college shot down 3 of the most advanced fighter aircraft on the planet, all while successfully defending the bombers they were sworn to protect. By the end of the war, the combat record of the Red Tails spoke for itself. They had flown thousands of sorties, destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground, and most importantly, they boasted one of the lowest bomber loss rates in the entire 15th Air Force. Their undeniable heroism paved the way for the eventual desegregation of the United States Armed Forces in 1948. Yet, the deepest tragedy of the Tuskegee Airmen is what happened when the engines finally cooled and the war was won. The white bomber crews they had saved returned home as celebrated heroes, marching in ticker-tape parades and utilizing the GI Bill to buy homes in pristine suburbs. The Red Tails, the guardian angels who had bled and died in the skies over Europe, returned to a country that still demanded they sit at the back of the bus. They stepped off troop ships only to be greeted by whites-only signs at the very train stations taking them home. Their medals and their combat records were not enough to shield them from the brutal reality of Jim Crow America. It would take decades for their story to be fully recognized, and for the nation to truly honor the men who had fought so brilliantly for a freedom they themselves were denied. The Red Tails proved that true courage is not just facing down a German jet at 25,000 feet. It is fighting for a country that has not yet learned to love you back. Thank you for stepping into the archive with me today. If you believe that history should be raw, honest, and unvarnished, make sure you subscribe to this channel and help us open more restricted files. We have countless more declassified chronicles waiting in the dark. Until next time, remember that the most profound victories are often the ones left out of the history books. I am Henry, and the archive is now closed.